It's all over. He will never fly again. He is dead. Icarus is dead. And yet, Dedalus, his father, had warned him. He had told him to be careful, to make sure that he always remained midway between the sea and the sun. If he flew too low, the foam of the waves would soak his wings. If he flew too high, the heat of the sun would scorch them. But Icarus did not heed his father's warning. Still, what kind of father would make a pair of wings for his son and encourage him to rival the flight of birds? What an insane idea. Dedalus must have been out of his mind to thus risk the life of the one person he truly cared for. But in fact, no, not at all. Dedalus was a most extraordinary inventor who had learned his skills from the goddess Athena herself. He was also a brilliant architect, a gifted artist, a sculptor who mastered his art to such perfection that, it was said, his statues had to be chained so that they would not run away. He once made a sculpture of Heracles that was so true to life that when the hero himself saw it, he was outraged and smashed it. But Dedalus had one fault. He was jealous. He could not bear the thought of anyone being more talented than he was. One morning, however, his nephew, Dedalus, invented the saw. Inspired by a fishbone, the young apprentice had copied it by carving out a series of notches in a piece of iron. The citizens of Athens were impressed by this invention. Dedalus, on the other hand, flew into an uncontrollable rage. One morning, he led Dedalus up to the top of the temple of Athena and pushed him off. Then he hurried back down to the base of the Acropolis and put Dedalus's body into a bag. He was planning to bury his nephew in secret. But his despicable crime was soon discovered. Dedalus was arrested and tried. In the end, because his many inventions had rendered a great service to humanity, the Athenians decided not to send him to prison, but to banish him from the city. And that is how Dedalus and his son Icarus came to live in Crete, in the court of its powerful king Minos. But that does not explain why Dedalus sent his son flying up into the sky, and thus risked seeing him come crashing down. It all began a long, long time ago. Zeus, whose reputation as a charmer was by now firmly established, had just left his latest conquest, a beautiful Phoenician princess named Europa. After changing himself into the form of a bull, he had abducted Europa from the shores of Tyre and whisked her away to the mountains of Crete. Europa bore him 3 beautiful children, all boys: Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Sarpedon. Their mother did not remain single for very long. There were many contenders. They all considered it a great honor to woo the woman who had been the lover of the master of Olympus. It was Asterius, the prince who reigned over Crete, who won her hand. Asterius married Europa and adopted her children, who then became his heirs. Many years went by. Then one day, in winter, Asterius died. The funeral was barely over before one of his 3 adopted sons, Minos, came forth and asserted his right to the crown. The two other brothers, however, did not agree. In order to support his claim to the throne, Minos maintained that the gods had given the kingdom to him, and as evidence, he declared that they would grant him anything he desired to ask of them. His brothers were, to say the least, rather skeptical. They dared him to prove it. Minos took up the challenge. After dedicating a temple to Poseidon, he begged the god of the sea to send a bull out of the waves, which he would then offer as a sacrifice. And then the impossible happened. As Rhadamanthus and Sarpedon and the entire congregation looked on, a magnificent bull with a dazzling white coat emerged from the sea. Never in living memory had anyone ever seen such a marvelous creature. Minos himself was struck with awe. He probably had not expected to see his wish granted in such an extraordinary way. It was such a wondrous act that his brothers had to give in. Minos became king of Crete. Minos thought Poseidon's bull was so beautiful that he decided to deceive the god. Instead of sacrificing the animal as he had promised, he sent it to be added to his own herds and slaughtered another in its place. Poseidon did not at all appreciate the king's double-dealing. The irascible god planned his revenge. It would be dreadful. A king without a queen is not quite a king. Once he had been crowned, Minos took as his wife a young woman named Pasiphae, which means she who shines for all. Pasiphae was the daughter of the sun god Helios and the nymph Crete. She was said to be immortal. And she was also said to be a magician, because she was able to kill any woman who tried to take her husband away from her. Anyone who slept with him would be covered with scorpions and serpents that were discharged from his body. 3 children were born of this royal union: 2 daughters, Ariadne and Phaedra, and a son, Androgeos. The royal couple were happy together. But unbeknownst to them, the offended Poseidon had concocted a diabolical scheme. One night, the god of the oceans crept into Queen Pasiphae's bedroom. He circled around her bed, whispering words that no one could understand, and then left. At first glance, nothing in particular seemed to happen. At first glance, because at dawn, Pasiphae woke up and to her astonishment found that she was madly in love, inflamed with passion, with an overpowering passion. For her husband? No. Pasiphae had fallen in love with the white bull that Minos had failed to sacrifice. In her confusion, not knowing how to slake the desire that burned within her, the irresistible desire that she felt for Poseidon's white bull, Queen Pasiphae went to see Dedalus. After he was banished from Athens, the renowned inventor had taken up residence in the royal court, where he enchanted Minos and his family with the animated wooden dolls and many other wonders he made for them. He would surely be able to find a way to help Pasiphae. Dedalus listened to the queen. What she was seeking defied his imagination. She was seeking to satisfy her desire for the white bull. Dedalus hesitated. Such a union between a woman and an animal seemed repulsive to him. He wanted to refuse, but Pasiphae threatened to have him and his son Icarus put to death if he did not obey her immediately. Dedalus had no choice. He had an idea. He built a wooden cow, covered it with a thick cowhide, and then mounted it on wheels which were concealed in its hooves. After pushing it into the meadow where Poseidon's bull was grazing, he showed Pasiphae how to get inside and how to open the little folded doors in the back of the cow. Then he quietly withdrew, preferring not to witness what would happen next. Nine months later, from this unnatural coupling was born a terrifying beast, a hybrid creature. It had a man's body with mighty shoulders and a broad chest, together with a bull's head. The Cretans called it the Minotaur, which means the bull of Minos. Minos was livid with rage, and his first impulse was to punish Dedalus for his thoughtless act. But then he changed his mind. What Dedalus did, he decided, Dedalus must undo. He ordered the architect to build a foolproof prison from which the Minotaur, that affront to the sacred institution of marriage, could never escape. Dedalus immediately went to work. Assisted by his young son Icarus, he began constructing the most extraordinary architectural structure, a labyrinth. A labyrinth that would be so complex that anyone who entered it would never be able to find his way out again. Anyone, including its creator. It was in this open-air fortress that Minos had the Minotaur imprisoned. But then the king received some devastating news. Androgeus, his only son, had been killed in Athens under suspicious circumstances. Minos held Aegeus, the monarch who ruled over Athens, responsible for his death. War broke out. Athens was under siege. The people of the city were facing starvation. In order to lift the siege, the Athenians sent word to Minos that they would submit to any terms of surrender he wanted. Minos did not think for very long. He demanded a payment of 7 boys and 7 girls to be sent to Crete every year so that he might offer them to the Minotaur. The Athenians had no choice. They had been defeated. For many years, they sent over the terrible tribute demanded by Minos. Until one day, Theseus, the young heir to the throne of Athens, decided to take it upon himself to eliminate the monster. Even though his father tried to dissuade him, Theseus joined the group of future victims and left for Crete. He was determined to slay the Minotaur. When he arrived in Crete, Theseus was taken to the palace of King Minos. His daughter, the Princess Ariadne, saw him and immediately fell in love with him. She did not want the handsome young man to be devoured by the Minotaur or lost in the labyrinth. Ariadne confided her thoughts to the only man who could help her, Dedalus. He was moved by the princess's feelings of love, by her desperation, and he decided to help her. A decision that would turn out to have fateful consequences. On the day that Theseus was to enter the labyrinth, Dedalus slipped a ball of thread into Ariadne's hand. She was to give it to Theseus. Once inside, all he had to do was to unravel the thread as he moved deeper into the maze, and then retrace his steps to find his way out again. Everything went exactly as planned. Theseus killed the Minotaur and was able to make his way safely out of the labyrinth by following Ariadne's thread. Then, on that very same day, he took the princess with him, and they sailed away from Crete. The news of what had happened threw Minos into a cold rage. He immediately sent out orders to have Dedalus and Icarus arrested and thrown into the labyrinth. So there they were, Dedalus and Icarus, imprisoned in the very structure they themselves had created. Although it was Dedalus who had designed the labyrinth, he, like everyone else, was unable to find his way out through the stifling, twisting rows of arid stone corridors. He just kept going round and round in circles. Finally, he had to admit defeat. He and his son were trapped in the bowels of his own maze. Icarus was filled with despair. He sat there on the dusty floor of the labyrinth. What else could he do but wait? Wait for who knows how long, as life passed him by slowly yet relentlessly. And then, when he pulled himself together and tried to find a way out of this prison, it was always the same thing. He became bewildered, lost, even more discouraged. And so Icarus sat back down and gazed at the sky. The sky, which symbolized the freedom that he no longer had. Icarus brooded despondently. Dedalus, in the meantime, was busy thinking. It wasn't the sky he was contemplating, but the birds. Up in the air above his head, they circled, they drifted. They soared, rising higher, vanishing into the clouds. They pursued each other in an aerial ballet full of lightness and elegance, and then came down to perch gently on top of the high walls of the labyrinth. An idea began to form in Daedalus's head. It would, of course, be impossible to climb over the walls of the labyrinth, but there was perhaps, if one dared, another way to escape, and the old craftsman was willing to give it a try. He shook Icarus out of his torpor and said, pointing his finger at the clouds, "We will leave by the sky." Icarus was dumbfounded. But knowing how clever and creative his father was, he did not ask any questions. He had faith in him. Right away, Dedalus told him to gather all of the bird feathers he could find. And they both set off to accomplish this long and laborious task. The two prisoners then took the feathers and laid them side by side, lining them up meticulously one by one from the smallest to the largest in size, so that their tips seemed to rise in a slope. When they'd finished arranging the feathers, Dedalus tied them together using flaxen threads torn from his tunic. Then, after binding them with wax, he gave the whole structure a slight curve in order to imitate the wings of a real bird. Icarus did the same thing, little knowing that he was making the instrument that would be the cause of his downfall. Dedalus put the wings on his son's back. He adjusted them and showed Icarus how to use them, telling him repeatedly how important it was to stay close to him and not to stray. Father and son were now ready. With Dedalus in front, they took off. And there they were, rising into the air, climbing higher into the sky, leaving the labyrinth far behind. From time to time, Dedalus would turn to check on his son to make sure he was following close behind and staying on course. In his excitement, Icarus took to flying more and more freely through the air. His youthfulness made him reckless. Gradually, Icarus, who kept soaring higher and higher, began to stray away from his father's path. Dedalus called out to him. He implored his son to come back. But the old man's voice was carried away by the wind. Besides, Icarus was no longer listening. He was oblivious to anything but the jubilation of flying, of rising to greater and greater heights. Why stay in between? Why take the middle course when we're offered the entire expanse of the sky? Let's go further, even higher. Nothing can stop us. For a moment or two, Icarus felt like the king of the universe. Now that he could fly, anything seemed possible to him. But as he continued to climb, the rays of the god of the sun began to melt the wax in his wings. All of a sudden, his flapping arms were no longer sustained by the wind. Icarus looked down at the sea far below. His heart skipped a beat. All of the wax had melted. His wings had fallen off. Icarus began to panic. He moved his arms, which were now bare. Nothing happened. He was falling. He wanted to cry out to his father, to call for help. Too late. The body hit the surface of the sea and was swallowed up by its emerald waters, leaving only a few forlorn feathers bobbing on the waves. That sea now bears the name of Daedalus's unfortunate son. It is called the Icarian Sea. Dedalus had defied the laws of nature twice. The first time, in order to help Pasiphae, who'd given birth to a monstrous beast. The second time, in order to escape, by turning men into birds for which he paid with the life of his son. One does not, with impunity, try to tamper with the laws of nature, and the gods do not like it when mortals seek to go beyond the limits of their human condition. That is what old Dedalus came to understand when, crippled by grief, he landed on a small, arid island far from Crete, which he renamed Icaria in honor of his lost son. For hundreds of years, sailors and travelers have, as they crossed the Icarian Sea, wondered about Icarus and his airborne quest. Are we any different from Icarus? From the child who lived in an open-air prison and dreamed of flying away to another place, a place he imagined might be better. Icarus may not have fallen because he had lost all sense of moderation. His father, Dedalus, was clever, but also cautious, observant, and inventive, but also a man of reason. Icarus, in spite of his father's explanations and warnings, refused to listen to the voice of experience. But as we all know, experience is a light that only illuminates oneself.